Today's guest is Susan Murphy. Very rarely does this happen, but Susan, being a former journalist, wrote a beautiful bio about herself, so I'm just going to read it with very few edits. At almost 68 years old and with more than 40 years in the broadcast industry, Susan Murphy has had more career reinventions than Madonna. She started as one of the nation's first radio traffic reporters in Philadelphia, moved to Florida to be a TV news reporter and a weather girl. That's what they called it back then. At 25, she helped start the first traffic reporting service in New York, then became a radio talk show host and producer, a news director on Long Island, a public television producer and on-air personality, a college dean and instructor, a voiceover artist, and now she is a broadcast voice coach. Susan, welcome to the program.
I am delighted to be here, Amanda. Yeah, that does about sum me up in 25 words or slightly more.
Yeah, well, I knew you were a journalist when I read your bio after you sent it to me, because I thought, well, she wrote it just perfectly and concisely, but you have done so many things, and I am originally from Philadelphia, so I don't remember your radio traffic reports, but probably we listened to them, I'm sure, when I was growing up. What part of Philadelphia are you from? Are you from that area?
Yes, I was born and raised in Philadelphia. Grew up in Elkins Park.
Okay, sure.
Worked for KYW News Radio, interned there, did all their summer programs when I was in high school. So where were you growing up in Philadelphia?
So I grew up in the suburbs, a little town called Devon, but it was close to Valley Forge Park, would be the best way to describe it.
Yes, I know where that is. Yep.
And not far from Villanova University. So we have another thing in common. Well, I'm so delighted to have you here today. I have interviewed, some of my former colleagues, but I don't think I've interviewed anybody who has had as many roles in the industry as you've had. So let's start at the beginning. What was your education and how did you get into broadcasting?
I was 14 years old and I got to do my first radio commercial accidentally. The girl who was supposed to do it was at summer camp because there was a delay in the recording. And her mother called and said, "Hey, Susan, you want to fill in for Julie?" "Sure, Mrs. Tucker, be happy to do that." And I played a teenage shoplifter for a department store commercial. And I realized, how little it took, an hour and a half later. Oh my goodness, they just paid me to talk. I'm going to investigate this. So I became a communications major in college and I stayed in Philadelphia, went to Temple University, marvelous broadcast communications program, still has a wonderful program to this day. And that's where it all just snowballed. I graduated from college at 20 and a half because, oh no, Mother and Dad, I don't need to go to Europe when I graduate. They had offered to do that, but I said no.
No gap year for you.
No, and I would every now and again will ask my mother, you know that offer to go to Europe? Nope, not valid anymore.
It doesn't. It's been taken off the table.
Exactly. So I got into the business quickly and have been working at it ever since. I sometimes like to say you can't shoot at a moving target. I've always been very aware of things that are missing, a gap that could be filled, a job that could exist. And that has sort of been my mantra since I was 18. And it's worked. I've done two things that were completely brand new that nobody else had thought about. One had to do with public television. We got $1 million grant to test it out. And then the other thing is this broadcast voice coaching. There are TV coaches. I'm sure you know them, many of them. But I work with voice. Well, I also work with writing because you have to do the two of them together. But I'm a broadcast voice coach because kids don't get any experience in voice anymore. Not that we got a lot coming up, but at least you always went to radio after you graduated from college. You never went straight to TV. That just was not heard of. So you got a little background in radio.
A funny story, and I don't know if you know this station, but I went to Northwestern for grad school, graduated in 1989, did not take any gap year, did not go to Europe, went right into work. And I was in Westchester, Pennsylvania at WCOJ. And the main anchor was a woman named Lisa Kearns, and she had a lovely voice. I mean, just a great radio voice. So at 22, I thought, well, I'll just imitate her because that'll be the best thing to do. And I remember I imitated her, and my dad, who was a lawyer in that community, called me and he said, "What the heck are you doing? You sound ridiculous."
Oh my
And
God.
so I thought, you know what? I'm just going to try my regular voice. And it worked pretty well. But I agree with you. The radio experience definitely hones that. I was tickled going back to your origin story. I was tickled that you said weather girl because I think that's a reflection of the changes in our industry. What are some of the biggest changes that you've seen as it relates to women in broadcasting?
Oh, there's a question we could spend 2 hours on. The biggest thing that I can sort of remember, I'm a little older than you, so as I was coming up in the late 70s, early 80s, and when I went to New York to start the Shadow Traffic Network and had to meet with every program director, GM, and sales manager at almost every radio station, I remember distinctly the looks on their faces when I would walk in, and they radiated to me, "What is this 25-year-old girl doing here?" Well, because I'm a traffic expert and you're not. So I just was always professional and just kept forging ahead. And by the time I got to television, it the camaraderie was easier in television because you're all working toward one goal of a product, of a TV show or whatever. And women were quickly promoted, particularly when I got to public television. I think they were far ahead of that game. And there were just ways that we could do things that broke an old boys network that was very often more efficient, um, sometimes less drama, but only sometimes. And so the movement in the communication industry into the early 2000s, I thought, yeah, we're doing it, we're moving, we're going. And then the internet came along and 9/11 happened, and all bets are off. I now find that women in our industry have taken steps back. Sure, we became news directors and assistant news directors and sales managers. That was big and still is. A lot of TV stations can brag about that. But I'm not sure what has gone wrong, why we're taking steps back. I think it's because the world is taking steps back too. That what you and I tried to do coming up in the 80s to the 2000s was to set the table, make the path for the young women behind us. And something happened. And now, working very closely with a lot of those young women, they are beset by toxic newsrooms. They are beset by ageism and prejudice and all kinds of dreadful things that I worked so hard to try to ameliorate or at least make it a little bit better for the generation behind me. And I found out that's not true. And
Yeah, I think you're right, and I think it may be cultural. I think that shift may be a cultural shift. I remember things being said to me that if they were said today, they would be an immediate lawsuit.
oh yeah,
One of the things that was said to me, back when TV involved actual tapes, when you would send a tape to a news director to get a job, if I said I didn't want to do something, I had one particular boss who said to me, "Well, I have 100 blondes on this stack of tapes behind me that do want to do it. So if you don't want to do it, they'll do it." And I just remember how, you just had no ability to talk back to that. I've done a few pivots, very few actually. I've actually stayed with the same company for 29 years. So my pivots were radio to TV, and then in the last 5 years to podcasting. But
right.
you've had a lot of pivots. What was the impetus for all of the changes you made? I mean, was it different each time?
Yes, it was different or another aspect of each time. And I think it's just because of my natural curiosity. I I always thought I would be in news forever. And TV news, my first time through, I just didn't care for it as much as I did radio. Radio and podcasting, are you kidding me? We paint vivid pictures. We allow people to eavesdrop on our conversations. It's less intimidating. They don't care about how your hair looks. I've always loved an audio-based project before television, but there are always new frontiers. There's always something around the corner that I would just go looking for, and very often would find it and then make a pitch to do it. And lo and behold, I did. So it's just curiosity that kept me moving forward, doing all kinds of different things. And many times it was, for example, back in the 90s, I did a lot of the burgeoning phone tree recordings, press one, press two to check your balance, press three. Because in the early 90s, the internet hadn't caught up with that yet. And everybody was pressing one, pressing two, pressing three. And I was on Long Island, and one of the companies, one of the biggest in the world that did that sort of service, asked me to audition. Yeah, okay, sure. It was a 15-minute drive. I went and did it and became the voice for some very, very big clients back in the day. American Express, Bank of America, City of New York, Weight Watchers, I just had bazillions of them until the internet caught up, and now there's less and less and less of that. And now if I do a couple of recordings a year for a particular, still the City of New York, and some insurance companies still have it. So, okay, let me find out what else I can do. So let me go into teaching. Let me become an assistant dean at Hofstra University. And then it was, what can I invent? What can I add? What kind of value? I guess it's all about the jobs you do and how you do them. I'm all about creating value. What's next? How do we, as I say to the young women and men that I coach with, you always have to push the story ahead. That's what I did on my career. Yeah.
Right. And and in this case, you're pushing not a story for news, but you're pushing your story. And I find it fascinating. You're talking about the voices for these different companies and government organizations. I've never thought about that as a job. So that's great that that's something that actually exists. If you have a great voice, why not?
Yeah.
Are there roadblocks for women that are different, do you think, than men? Just in general in the industry and things that you've come across over the years?
There are no huge roadblocks. You're always going to find one or two. And I do think if we keep going, and there were times when I started the Shadow Traffic Reporting Network in New York. We hired kids straight out of college with good voices, whatever, and we worked split shifts. We would come in at 4:30 in the morning, work until 11. Everybody could go home. You come back in at 3:30. You work until 7. Who does that anymore? That's insane. But you had to make sacrifices. You had to be willing to put the work in. It was like a startup company to some degree. That then became huge and then got sold a couple of years later and has had several iterations, as Shadow Traffic did. But it was just a matter of putting the work in. And I'm not so sure today young people are willing to put in the kind of work we did, right or wrong. I'm not making a judgment necessarily on that. And I do know the MMJs. Whoever thought that was a good idea? Multimedia journalists, those kids who have to go out and set up the camera, set up the light, shoot it, ask the questions, do their stand-ups all by themselves, and then come back, voice it, and edit it. Such a bad idea.
Yeah, we actually called it back in the day, and you probably did too, one-man bands. And
Right.
I did it in the 80s, late 80s, and I had a Ikegami camera,
Oh
which
my,
was about 25 pounds. If you remember, it was attached to a deck with a command cable. And then, of course, if you were lucky that day, if you checked out the tripod, we had one tripod in our bureau, you got the tripod and maybe a light, maybe. And the
right.
batteries for all of this was a big battery pack that went around your waist. But of course, I was too small to wear it around my waist. So it went around me like crossbody, like I, had ammunition
Right.
strapped to my body. I looked a little bit like Rambo. And altogether, it probably weighed half as much as I did at the time. It was pretty insane. And
It was,
it broke all the time. So there was that too.
right.
But yeah, I agree with you that has come back, even though the cameras are smaller and everything, all the editing is on laptops,
Yep.
which makes it somewhat easier, but it still isn't the best plan. Um, I am really interested in the voice coaching because I love the fact that you talked in your bio about how young women still hold on to their little girl voice. And I'm assuming that you coach people from all different industries, not just TV.
I
And I
do.
really think that's true. Full disclosure, I had a little voice coaching in my second job in Maine, and my boss said that he didn't like the way I sounded because I didn't sound like everybody else, which obviously today we know that sounding like everybody else is a bad idea.
Oh, sure is.
Right. But back then, we had the little sing song delivery, the little cadence that we did, da 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 da. And so I went to about, I don't even know, 6, 8, 10 lessons. And at the end, I asked the coach, I said, off the record, what advice would you give me? And she said, just use your normal voice.
Hmm.
And so that was it. That was my that was my experience, and it actually worked for the rest of my career. I use my voice, and to this day, anywhere I go, when I call anybody in the Raleigh area, they say, "Oh, you're Amanda Lamb." So it's distinctive.
Yeah.
But talk a little bit about the coaching and specifically helping women, um, for lack of a better phrase, get their big girl voice on.
Yep. It's fully true for about 15 to 20% of the clients I work with. And I never thought this was not part of what I envisioned when I became a voice coach in terms of helping a young woman step into something that she doesn't even know she has. And it's partly physiological. Boys' voices change during puberty. Their vocal cords grow, their Adam's apples grow. That accounts for their deeper voice. Girls, our vocal cords stay exactly the same. They're about the size of a dime. We don't have any indication that we should use our big girl voice. So a lot of women just don't know how to get in touch with that. And so as you pass 12 and 13 and 16, any teenager we all, and even some of us older ladies, will squeal when we see people we love. Right. So a lot of that just continues, and women don't know that they have a natural pitch that sits at the bottom of their diaphragm. It is bolder, it is rounder, it is warmer than they know because they just really don't know how to access it. So what I do is we always start with breath work to sort of give them an idea of where sound and energy come from. And that takes about an hour. And that's the first thing I do with my clients. And then I do a little test to see if that worked. For about 15% of the women I work with, I've got a couple of other tricks in my bag and I'll pull them all out. And if I'm not getting the voice that I know I should be able to hear, then we have to have a little conversation about what it was like for them growing up. Things like, hey, every family is dysfunctional. It's just a matter of degree. So, what was it like for you growing up? Were you the oldest? Were you in the middle? Did you have brothers who got all the attention? Did Were you kind of shoved aside? Did nobody care what you wanted to talk about? Were you not listened to? Were you just always treated like a little girl because your voice sounded like that little girl? And particularly in your relationships with older male figures, perhaps that little girl voice got you what you needed to get through whatever. Were you bullied at school? Could that have had something to do with it? For one woman I know, she had a kind of a very deep voice and was bullied for that. So we worked on a lighter sound for her, but usually it's the other way around. And I've done this with ministers and nurses and CEOs, and I've even worked with psychologists who do a lot of phone coaching on terms of intonation and pitch and tone. And I remember I was working with a a minister who freely admitted that when you go to seminary school, they tell you how to write a sermon, but they don't really teach you how to deliver it. So we were talking about voice and bold and air and energy. And again, I was having trouble getting her real voice. And I said, could we talk a little bit about what it was like for you as a girl? And she's a young woman of color who happens to have a 5-year-old daughter herself. And as I kind of painted some scenarios for her, her eyes filled with tears. And she said, "Oh my God, in my family, that's generational. Women were never thought to have a reasonable opinion. Their advice was not sought. Nobody wanted to care what grandmom thought about anything." And she said, "And I have a 5-year-old daughter, and I am not going to let that happen to her." So what happened, it's like a switch in her brain went on, and her sermons and how she presents herself in public, in the pulpit and out of the pulpit, is so much different and so much stronger and so much more authoritative and so much more her.
I mean, that's so incredible. It just shows how many layers there are, right, to our voices that we don't even think about. Why does it sound like this? Where does it come from? I know that sometimes when I would hear my voice on a recording, whether it's TV, radio, podcasting, I wouldn't even recognize it because I think we hear ourselves differently, right, when we're talking than when we hear it recorded.
Right.
But, that's just fascinating that you've been able to do that and with such purpose to help people get to that, because I do know women in my experience in my lifetime that have had that issue where, like you said, maybe they got more with the little girl voice, but now it's time to, step up their game, be their authentic selves. And a lot of what we do in this podcast is talk about transformation, and we talk about next steps, right? And this perfectly dovetails into the theme of the show. You've been able to do it. You've been able to reinvent yourself many times over, but a lot of women don't feel like they can do that. They feel stuck. They feel unseen. They feel like they don't really have anything to offer.
Right.
What kind of advice would you give to women about finding that next chapter?
I think, for a lot of women, that is very, very difficult because of how they were treated as children and getting into their young adulthoods. And in my case, I had two parents who worked a lot. So my sisters and I pretty much raised ourselves. We didn't have a lot of applause. You had to, our whole thing was, if you stay out of trouble, just stay under the radar. And so I didn't have anybody pushing behind me saying, "Yay, you," but I also didn't have anybody saying, "What's the matter with you? Why you don't want to do this? You can't be a broadcaster," whatever. So I was sort of lucky, I guess, to have that. I was not squished by anyone. And I think, which is why I always start with the voice in terms of reporting, an anchor, a meteorologist, sports person, whatever, because confidence grows from your voice. Confidence grows from learning how to master what is naturally yours. And there are lots of tips and tricks and strategies for you to sound better. I don't change you. I don't make it different. We don't put on a cape and suddenly you're Superwoman. I just help you find what you don't know is there. And when you can access that and you can start to make some change, people suddenly in the boardroom want to listen to what you have to say. People at the PTA meeting will turn around and stop talking because you're talking. And that does so much for any person, never mind woman, but it does so much, and it allows you to take more steps, little bit at a time. So it's a confidence thing as well as it is a physiological and psychological breath thing in terms of your voice. I believe our voices are as distinct as our fingerprints. And so you have to be very mindful and very careful when talking about voice. And when you're dealing with something that is so intimate, I am very aware of and careful about how I present things. Now, there are some women, too, that I can think of off the top of my head, who chose to end working with me because they thought they were fine and they didn't need it and this was ridiculous. All right, that's fine. You can do that. So I think if you make the commitment to bolster that voice, build that confidence, it's going to allow you to have confidence in other areas. Just in terms of speaking with your spouse or children, some good public speaking tips can go a long way. And I've often thought, I kind of wish I had known this back then. When we're more mindful in our speech, when we are given to active listening, and when we are careful about finishing sentences and taking pauses before rushing into anything, I think we would be kinder, gentler people, and we would be less likely to say things that we later regret. So it's an aspect of confidence and agency, and you having the right to be who you are, and you are enough to take those baby steps with your voice and see where else it goes. A CFO that I worked with in Australia has gotten into politics thanks to what I could show her. I mean, like I said, I don't invent anything. I just show you where it is and how you can master it. And for some women, it's been life-changing. One young woman, she's a reporter in Philadelphia. When we first started working together, she had just broken up with a boyfriend whose last words to her were, "And you know what? I never even liked your voice anyway."
Oh my gosh. You bring up a good point about the talking and how you listen and how important that is. We had an etiquette coach on earlier in the season, and she talked about that you should be speaking 80%, excuse me, you should be listening 80% of the time and speaking 20% of the time when you're in a conversation with a new person. And so I've tried to do that, especially as I do my interviews, because in TV we did the interviews so quickly, whereas these interviews, have some time to breathe. What's on your bucket list, Susan? What else have you not done? I mean, you've done so much. Anything else out there?
Well, I used to say that the one thing I always wanted in my career, I had done radio for a while. I've never had a TV promo made about me, and I've never had jingle singers sing my name. That to me was a very big thing back in the day. I've never had, and when I retired from a particular radio station, I even hinted, like, could you get the ad agency who works with the jingle singers? And it turns out they couldn't. But that's what I always wanted. It's little. I've had a really rich, full life. Professionally, there is nothing in my life that I would take back. Personally, that's another hour. But professionally, I have loved every chance I took. I have more or less loved every job I had. And one of the reasons I am a voice coach is so many people helped me on the way up and along the path that the only way I can say thank you is to pay it forward. And this is a joy for me.
Well, thank you so much for being on the show. How can people find you or follow your work? And I will put all of your links in my notes.
The easiest way is my website, susanmurphyvosot.com, VOSOT.com. I thought I was only going to ever work with people in the industry. So we all know what VOSOT means. VOSOT is voiceover sound on tape. It's just broadcast shorthand for something. So I get to teach people a little bit about, behind the scenes in TV. SusanMurphyVosot.com, or I'm on LinkedIn. There are a million Susan Murphys, so just do Susan Murphy Voice Coach and I'll pop right up. And you can get in touch with me there. And again, this is a joy, and I work with men and women. Get in touch with me if this is something that, and I've noticed that a lot of the clients I've had, it's like, yeah, I've been meaning to do this. Well, treat yourself.
Thank you so much. It's been so insightful and also great talking to a fellow Philadelphian and fellow recovering journalist. I call myself sometimes, depending on the day. And I really appreciate it. I think my listeners are going to get a lot out of our conversation.
I hope so. Cheesesteaks forever.